Hello, everyone. This is Ed Ferrari from Foundry, and I'd like to welcome you to our September edition of Modonaut Monday. In this session, we're going to be discussing some procedural modeling techniques. So over the next hour, we'll be discussing non-destructive modeling, the procedural stack, and Modo's mesh operations. We might hit some bumps along the way, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, because it will give us the opportunity to explore some workarounds. My hope is that by the end of this session, everyone will have an appreciation for Modo's powerful mesh operations. As always, I'll try my best to keep an eye on the chat window. So if you have any questions about what I'm doing, please feel free to ask. My only request is that you be mindful of the delay in the stream. So if you ask a question, it's always best to be specific because you might be asking about something that I did 15 to 20 seconds ago, and that could confuse me. So I'm only mentioning this because I want to try and be as helpful as possible. But ultimately, you should feel free to ask me anything. Also, because we're streaming, I'm keeping some of my examples a little bit less complex, just so performance on my end doesn't take too hard of a hit. But technically, you should be able to take any of the techniques that I demonstrate today and use them on more ambitious models. So let's get started learning about procedural modeling. So here I am in Modo 11.1, and you can see I have a brand new scene with an empty mesh item. And I'm going to try to keep as much today as possible to proceduralism. So while you don't necessarily need to make everything procedural, you can mix procedural modeling with direct modeling. My goal is to use as much procedural as possible just to show you kind of what is possible. But it's probably better to mix and match the two methods. So here I'm in the Modo beta layout, which is new to Modo 12.1. And if I want to see the mesh operation stack, I actually have to use these buttons up here, which is a little bit different from the standard modeling tab. If I come over to the standard modeling layout, we have a mesh ops tab right here, which shows the item list above the procedural stack. So it's a little bit different in the Modo beta layout. In my opinion, it's actually better. We have these buttons up here on the top right. Now, if you don't see these, you might have this bar collapsed. So if you don't see them, you'll have to click on this thin black bar, and that brings up these nice options here. And if you click on this second green icon, you get the mesh op stack. So you might see these green buttons throughout the UI. So we have a similar option right here at the bottom. If you don't see these green buttons, it might be collapsed. You can just click on that little thin black bar. And if you don't want to click on these buttons, you have a nice kind of hotkey. Press Alt spacebar, and you can toggle the right viewport, the lower viewport, and the left viewport. And if you want the mesh op stack on the left side of the viewport, you might not see the procedural stack button here. We have a nice button for the schematic and the UV viewport, but it's pretty flexible. You have this little plus icon here. If you click on that, you see you have 3 custom buttons, and at the moment they're all hidden. But if I make any of these, in this case, I'll choose custom A. If I just expand that, you can see we have a custom button here. So if I click on that, you can see it's just blank. It says none. But if I click on the little arrow here, and then come down to, let's see, data lists, mesh operations. So here, if you want your mesh op stack on the left side, you can just hide your right viewport. And here you have the mesh op stack on the left side. I personally like having it on the right side, so I'll just press Alt spacebar and bring up the right viewport from the pie menu. And now we can get started. So I think what we're going to do today is just work on a little project. I'm just going to create a little cartoon skull, and we're going to do this completely procedurally. So I have this empty mesh item here. If I select it, I'm just going to rename it skull underscore face. And you can see that it's totally empty, but I'm going to populate this little mesh item with a procedural cube. So I'll come over to add operator, and I can either type in cube or I can just find it in this list. So here's the cube. I'll double click on that. And now we have a nice procedural unit cube that is 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter. Now, something that I like to do is when I'm dealing with a cube, if I just scale it you can see when I change the scale of the x, the position actually doesn't automatically go back to 0. So if I want this to be centered near the world origin, I have to type in 0 in the position x. And then if I want to maybe scale this some more, you can see it's a little bit off center, so I have to come back to position x and press 0, or type in 0 in the position x number field. And I have to keep doing that. That's a little bit different from if we were to create a procedural sphere. So if I come over to add operator and find sphere, I'll just move this sphere up a little bit. If I were to change the scale of the sphere in the x, you can see it stays at 0 on the x-axis, and it just scales in both directions. And it's the same for z. It's always kind of centered on the z-axis, even if I change the scale. So let me just delete this procedural sphere and come back to the cube. And that's different with the cube. So if I scale this in the z, you can see if I want it to be centered again, I have to come over to the position z value and press 0. So we're just going to do a little bit of quick rigging, just very simple schematic, basically not really rigging, just we're going to link some channels to make it so that we don't have to keep changing the position. So let me just put this size or scale back to 1 meter, and I'll press Alt spacebar to show the lower viewport. And I'm going to drag this cube into the schematic. So I just dragged that procedural cube directly into the schematic. So I'll double click this yellow diamond just to show the mesh item that this procedural cube lives within. And now I'm going to come over to the cube and I'll select the position. So I'm clicking on the position X right here in the channel section of the cube properties. And then holding shift, I'll just click on size Z, and everything in between is selected. And now if I just left click and drag that into the schematic, you can see all of these channels have been brought in underneath this cube node. So I want to separate the position from the size, because even though I can link the size X to the position X, I just like to keep it a little bit more kind of visually logical. So I want a left to right flow. So I'm just going to select the position X, Y, and Z while holding shift, right click, and separate channel. So now we've separated those channels, and you can see that both of these nodes are called cube. And if I were to change the name of this cube mesh op to cube_A, you can see that the name carries over. And the only reason I'm showing that is just to illustrate that these two nodes actually belong to the same procedural cube mesh operation. And you also see these 3 dots down here. This is just an indicator that there are other channels existing within the schematic. So if you're working on a complex schematic and maybe this node gets lost, it's off screen, these 3 dots indicate that somewhere else in the schematic this exists. So I can just pull that back in there like so. Now I don't want to simply tie or connect the size X to the position X, because if I do that, and I'll do that for the Y and Z as well, you can see the cube actually shifts. The reason this is happening is because the size X, size Y, and size Z has a value of 1 meter. And since they're now connected, the position X, Y, and Z are getting shifted in 1 meter in X, Y, and Z. So what I actually want to do is add a basic math multiply operator. So in the schematic, I'll click add basic math multiply, and that gives us this little multiplication node. And if I click on this, you can see that value B is 0, and that's this little dot right here. So I'm going to bring size X into value A, and I'm actually going to duplicate this basic math node. So Control D and Control D, and I actually don't want them connected to size X. I want these each to be connected to size Y and size Z, like so. Now, when I connect each of these basic math nodes to position X, Y, and Z, the cube is not going to move, because the size X, Y, and Z, no matter what it is, no matter what number we have in the size X, Y, and Z value, it's going to be multiplied by 0, and anything multiplied by 0 will be 0. So the position X, Y, and Z is always going to be 0. So now if I were to take the cube and, let's see, change the scale of it, no longer have to return to the position X, Y, and Z values to reset them to 0. They'll just always be 0. I find that to be pretty handy sometimes. And you can make this a little assembly and save this and just bring it in so you never have to kind of do that little setup. Even though it wasn't complicated, just never have to do that again if you save out an assembly. So I'm going to take the X, Y, and Z and just set that back to 1 meter. Let me just make sure that's 1 meter in all 3 values. And what we're going to do is actually add a subdivide node on top of this. So add operator, subdivide. And I can either right click and duplicate this, or I can just add another operator. So we'll just add another subdivide. Double click that. And maybe we'll add one more. So subdivide. So now we have basically a quad sphere or a quad ball. Now, if I were to change these subdivide properties, maybe this subdivision method, I don't want it to be Catmull-Clark. I'll change it back to faceted. You can see it changes the shape. So this is the power of proceduralism. This is just kind of the tip of the iceberg. I'm not basically set with what I have here. I can always go back and change it. So I can change this subdivision from Catmull-Clark to faceted, and we can walk up and down the procedural stack. Now, like many other systems within Modo, the procedural stack has an order of operations, and it starts at the bottom and then works its way up. And we're going to see more and more of that in further examples. So if I were to bring this cube A above the subdivision, you can see that we no longer have any subdivisions because these subdivide mesh ops are happening on an empty mesh. And then we're adding the cube mesh op. So we want to add the cube first and then the subdivide mesh ops. So I'll just change that back to Catmull-Clark. I'll change this subdivision method back to Catmull-Clark so that we have a nice quad ball. Okay, so this is basically going to be the base of our sphere. And I'll press Alt spacebar and toggle off the lower viewport. And I'll press N for a new mesh item. And I'll call this skull_outer, because this will be the outer part of our skull. And I'm going to hide the skull base. And in this skull outer empty mesh item, I'm going to add an operator. We'll just choose a merge meshes mesh op. And the merge meshes mesh op is basically Modo's procedural method for duplicating or instancing. And if I toggle this little arrow, or if I expand this, you can see it's looking for a source. So I'm going to click Add Sources, and I'll just clear the filter field, and I'll choose skull base. So here is our skull base. This is just the duplicated version of what we just created. And I'm going to actually create another mesh item, so N for new mesh item, and I'll call this back trim, back_trim, because we're going to create a procedural cube, and we're going to trim the back of this sphere. So click on Add Operator, and then I'll just search for cube, and then I'll just move this cube into place. Now, this cube, it's not as important for it to be centered all the time. It's just not as important because we want to just move this around and use it as a trim item. We're just going to subtract this with Modo's procedural Boolean mesh up. I'll just move this like so. And I will add some segments to this. So in the cube item properties, in the segments section, I'll just start adding some segments, maybe 8 on X, maybe 8 on Y, and 4 on Z. That looks good. And then I will just zero this out on X and Y, like so. Okay, and then I'm going to hide this back trim item. And I'll come back to the skull outer. And on top of this merge meshes mesh op, I'm going to add a Boolean. So add operator, and then I'll just start typing BOOL for Boolean, and it filters it out, and I'll double click on Boolean. That brings up this create Boolean mesh operator dialog. And I'm just going to come over to driver surface. We want to choose back trim, which is that cube that we just created. And then the operation is subtract, and I'll click OK. And you can see straight away that cube that we just created is trimming away from the sphere. Now, if I toggle the visibility of this Boolean mesh op, you can see we get our full sphere back. So it's totally non-destructive. I can also click on the back trim mesh item, and even though it's invisible, I can press W for the move tool while I'm in items mode, and I can actually move this to get some interactive kind of booleaning. And if I bring the cube too far in, you can see we start to see the back of the sphere again. So I'll just keep that to about there. It looks pretty good to me. You'll notice in the cube mesh app, we have position and size, but we don't have the ability to rotate. And if I try to press E for rotate while in polygons mode, we get the rotate tool active layer contains no data for operation. So we can't actually rotate. We can't manipulate any of the mesh operations at the element or component level, but we can at the item level if we select the entire mesh item or mesh layer. So if I were to press E while in items mode, we can actually rotate this if we wanted to, just to give it a little bit more kind of an angle. Okay, so let's actually hollow this out, and we'll do that with another merge meshes mesh operation. So I'll press N for a new mesh item, and I'll rename this skull underscore inner, and I'm going to add an operator. We're going to add a merge meshes mesh op, and I'll once again expand the sources and add a source. We're going to use the skull base again. You can see it is kind of laying directly on top of our other merge meshes mesh op. So above this merge meshes mesh operation, I'm going to add a push mesh operation. Here's our push mesh op. Let's make sure that I can see the handle. So I pressed 5 to make sure I could see the handle. And I'll just push this inward by selecting this blue handle, and that changes the distance. So I just brought that in negative 28 millimeters. And then I'm going to hide the inner mesh item. I'll select the skull outer, and I'm going to add another Boolean on top of this existing Boolean. So add operator, Boolean. This time the driver surface will be the skull inner. And once again, we want to subtract, so I'll click OK. And let me just press Control 1 to bring up my main pie menu and toggle the grid work plane. So here you can see trimming the back, and then we're trimming the inside. We're hollowing it out. And I toggle the visibility of this, you can see we can actually still go back and change things. We're not locked into that design. So this is very iterative. So let's make some eye sockets for this cartoon skull. So N for a new mesh item. I'll just call this eye sockets. And I'll add an operator in this new empty mesh item. So add operator, and I'll choose a capsule. And the capsules by default come in as polar. So they have these poles at the top and bottom. And I'm just going to change that in the capsule properties. So the ends here, we'll change that to quad grid. And let's just change the scale of this a little bit. Pull this down. Pull this in a little bit like so. So let's see, we want the Z and the X to be the same. So we'll do 150 millimeters. And I want to change the end size from 250 millimeters. Just bring that up a little bit. And I also want to scale this in like so. And I'm okay with the segments and the sides. 24 sides is pretty good. I might actually want this to be a little bit less than 150. So we'll do 125 millimeters on the X and Z. There we go. So again, I can change the position and the radius or the size of this capsule. But if I press E for rotate while in polygons mode, we get that, that error. Now I can rotate this to position this capsule at the item level, but instead I'm going to use a transform effector or a locator. So above this capsule, I'm going to click add operator, and I'll just type in LOC for locator. And you'll see instead of seeing a locator, we see a transform effector. But for all intents and purposes, it's really the same thing. So I'll double click transform effector, and that gives us this transform effector. And if I expand the transform effector, you can see we have a locator here. So I can just rename that I underscore mover. What we're going to do is we'll press W for move, and we'll just move this in the X. We'll move this into Z, and then we'll rotate it. So E for rotate, and I'll just rotate that like so. And you can see my rotation handles are starting to kind of overlap each other. So to avoid gimbal, I'm just going to press Alt-X. That just puts us into local action center mode. You can also get there by just clicking local right here, making sure that you're in local mode. And then W for move, I'll just move this into place like so. And even though we spent some time adjusting the scale on the capsule level, we can also just adjust the scale of the locator, and the capsule will change as well. So I pressed R for scale, and I'm just changing the scale a little bit. Let's move this down. E for rotate, rotate that down like so. Okay, so this is going to be a Boolean, and we're going to get a nice hole in our kind of bowl shape here. But I want 2 eye sockets, not just one. So that gives us the opportunity to use the mirror generator. So above the transform effector, I'm going to add an operator. I'll type in mirror, and I'll choose mirror. And here we go. So now we have this kind of wall-eyed character. And if I select the locator, the transform effector, I can press W for move and just move this inwards. E for rotate, like so. And I could rotate this down a little bit. And for now, I think that's pretty good. So I can hide the eye socket mesh operation. I can also hide the eye mover locator. And I can come back to the skull outer procedural item. And we can once again add another Boolean. So on top of this Boolean, I'll add an operator. We'll type in Boolean, select it. It's going to ask us for a driver surface. I'll choose eye sockets and click OK. So now you can see the kind of effect that we're getting. Now I can kind of see some tearing happening right here. It doesn't look like it's airtight. And I think the reason for that is because if I come over to the eye sockets, if I select the capsule mesh item, the polygon type is subdivision. So I'm going to change that to face, and that should make it nice and airtight. So that we're dealing with face base mesh, and the driver surface for the subtractive Boolean is also in faces mode. So let's just give this character a mouth and some teeth, and then we'll be done for the modeling portion of this. And at that point, we'll just work on tweaking this and going back and changing some of the base features. So I'll press N for new mesh item, and I'll call this mouth underscore slot. And I'll add an operator. We'll choose a cube again. And I want this to be really, really thin in the Y. So I'll just move this into place, like so. And I'll make this a little bit thinner in Y. And we'll just move this back. And maybe we'll make this a little bit wider in X. Okay, so I think that's pretty good. Maybe I'll lower this a little tiny bit. Now we'll just add some segments to this. So this cube needs to have some segments. In Y, we just want 1 or 2. We'll just do 1. In X, we'll do a whole bunch. Let's just try 12. And in Z, we'll try 8. Okay, and then I'll just hide this. We're going to hide the mouth underscore slot item, come back over to the skull outer. Once again, we'll add another Boolean. And instead of the eye sockets, we'll choose mouth underscore slot, and we want to subtract. And now he has kind of a happy face, or he's not too happy. He looks a little bit alarmed actually. But let's give him some teeth. You can also see some kind of shading errors here, which we can definitely address by either adjusting the driver surfaces or by adjusting the shading. We can just use the nice smoothing groups once this is all outputted. Okay, so let's work on the teeth. So N for new mesh item. I'll rename this empty mesh teeth. And I'll add an operator. Once again, we're going to use a cube. And I just want to quickly make a very small tooth. This is going to be very thin. so. And I want it to be a little bit longer in the z-axis, and then we'll put it into place. So 0 on x, so it's nice and centered. That looks pretty good. And I'll just move it back in z a little bit more and lower it. Okay. So I want it to have more segments, so I'll just increase the x segments to 2, and then the y segments we'll do 6, and maybe 10 on the z. Okay, so we're going to Boolean subtract this, but before we do, I just want to get this to, I want to radial array it so we get a nice, like a clone of this tooth a bunch of times. So above this cube, I'll add an operator, and I'll type in radial, and then I can see here we have radial array, so I'll double click that. And here you can see we have a bunch of arrays. So I don't want to use all of these to kind of cut into our base mesh. So I'll select the teeth item and press 3 to go into polygons mode. And then I'll just select some polygons from each of the arrayed cubes that I want to delete. And then I'll press, let me grab this one too. And I'll press close square bracket on the keyboard, and that will select all the contiguous islands. And now you'll notice if I press Control X, it just won't work. I can't delete these the standard direct modeling way. So above this radial array with these polygons selected, I'll add an operator and I'll type in delete. And that allows us to delete those polygons. And if I click the eyeball icon next to delete, you can see it's non-destructive. We can always get those polygons back. So now I'm just going to hide this teeth mesh item, come back over to the skull outer item, and once again, add another Boolean. So click Boolean. This time we want the teeth. We want to subtract this, so I'll click OK. And you can see the kind of effect we're getting. Now I'm really starting to see the facets on this outer, on the outer part of this bowl shape, this hemisphere. So let me actually come back over to the skull base, and I'll just add another subdivide. So add operator, subdivide. Okay, so now if I come back over to the skull outer, you can see it's more dense, but the faceting isn't as apparent. And that basically also means that we're not seeing as many kind of shading artifacts, or it's not as obvious. Now, I don't like how low these teeth are, so let me actually come back to the teeth, and I'll select the original cube, and I'll turn on ghost mode, which is this icon here, which allows us to see our original, and all of the subsequent mesh operations are this blue color. So I'm just going to grab this green handle and just bring this up a little bit, like so. And then I'll just deselect the cube, turn off ghost mode, and deselect the teeth. And that's closer to what I was going for. Now, what if I wanted to assign some color to this? You'll notice that if I select the skull outer and select some of the polygons and press M for assigning a material, it just won't allow us to do that because you can't do that in that way with a procedural item. So above this Boolean, I'm going to add an operator, and I'll just type in selection because we're going to assign a selection set. And I'll double click that. And now we have an assigned selection set mesh item. I'll give this a name. We'll call this skull underscore whole because this is going to kind of be the material for the entire or whole skull. And now in the shader tree, you can see we have no groups yet. So I'll add a layer. I'll choose group. And then inside this group, I'll add a material. And this material, we'll just make this a red, kind of a reddish color for a red skull. And this group, right now it's affecting everything, but it's set to material. And we created a selection set right here. So I'm going to change the polygon tag type from material to selection set. And then the polygon tag from none to skull underscore whole, like so. And what's nice about this is that if I click this button here to change my 3D viewport to the preview window, you can see that we're getting some kind of sharp angles between the booleans. But if I select the material and enable rounded edge width, we'll set that to, see, 5 millimeters. You can see we get a nice little micro bevel there. That might be a little bit too harsh. Let me bump that down to 4 millimeters. But it's just a render trick that we can do. And if you don't like this faceting, you can always go back to the capsule mesh op and increase the number of sides and segments. But if you look down here on the teeth, right here, this rounded edge width really makes a difference. So if I put that back down to 0, you can see that little micro bevel disappears. So we don't get that light hit right on the edge. But increasing that to 4 millimeters gives us that nice little hit. So what if we wanted the inside of this, let's just call this a mask. What if we want the inside of this mask to be a different color from the outside? So there's a few different things we can do, but I think the smartest thing to do would be to assign selection sets and then use the select by previous selection operation. So let me just save this really quickly. So Control S, and I'll just save it to my desktop. We'll call it MM for Modonaut Monday, test_01. Click save. Okay. So come over to the first Boolean operation, and if I turn on ghosted mode, you can see we can kind of climb up and down the different procedural items. So we start off with this merge meshes mesh op, which gives us the sphere, and then we get this Boolean, which trims the back. Then we get this Boolean, which hollows it out, and then the next Boolean gives us the eyes. The next one gives us the mouth slot. The next one gives us the teeth. And then we get the selection set that gives us the color. So let's go over to the first Boolean, and let's add a selection set. We're going to assign a selection set. We'll call this back_trim. And we want to make sure the selection set type is polygon. And then I'm going to expand the selection set procedural so we can get to the selection, and I'll add a selection. And we're going to choose previous. I'll double click select by previous operation. In the select by previous operation properties, we want the blend mode to be override, the source item to be Boolean, which is this first Boolean here. And then the name, this is kind of what part of the Boolean we're going to actually assign the selection set to. We want it to be polygons from driver surface, which is that cube that's responsible for trimming off the back. So I'll choose polygons from driver surface. And now you can see the back is kind of shaded here. So now if I come over to the shader tree, and within this skull_hole group, I add another group, and then I add a constant. And this might be something some of you may remember if you've seen the last Modonaut Monday that covered the shader tree. I can change the constant color from black to, let's choose like a cool blue, kind of like a pale blue. And this group, rather than being a material, it's going to be a selection set. And the polygon tag is going to be our back trim. So now if I turn off ghosting, you can see just the back polygons are blue. And we can do the same thing for all of these. So let me just add a selection set above this second Boolean, which is responsible for the hollowing. So I'll add an operator, choose selection set. We want this selection type to be polygon. The name of this will be hollow. We can really name it anything we want, but I'll just choose hollow. And then I'll expand the selection. We'll add a select by previous. You can see previous is already typed in the filter box, but there's two select by previous options. When you're doing this, you always want to select a new. You don't want the existing one because we don't want the properties from the existing selection set. We want to create a new one. So I'll double click that. The source item will be Boolean 2, and the name will be polygons from driver surface. And if I turn on ghosting, you can see the kind of dark gray shaded polygons. That's what's going to be affected. So I'll turn ghosting off, come back over to my shader tree, skull_hole, we'll add a group. And instead of creating a new constant, I'll just right click and instance this existing constant. So right click, create instance, and I'll drag that instance into the new group. That overrides everything. So I'm going to select the group, change the polygon tag type from material to selection set, and change the polygon tag to hollow. So now you can see the effect that we're getting. So let's just do the same thing for the eyes and the mouth. So above this Boolean, we're going to add an operator. We'll choose selection set. I'll change the selection type to polygon. I'll give this a name. We'll call it eyes. We'll expand the selection set so that we can give it a selection operator or selection operation. Add selection. We want a new select by previous. We don't want the existing one. So create a new one. We'll choose Boolean 3 from the source item, and we'll choose polygons from driver surface. Now nothing has happened because we have to come over to the shader tree and create a new group. And I'll drag that group above the hollow. And now instead of instancing the constant again, you can see this constant 2 is italicized, which means that it's an instance. If you duplicate an instance, it just creates another instance. So I'll drag that into this new group, and that overrides everything. So I have to come over to the material group and choose selection set and eyes from the polygon tag type. So now the inner border of the eyes are blue as well. Again, we'll just really quickly do that for the mouth and teeth. So add operator, assign selection set, give this a name. We'll just call this mouth. We'll assign the select by previous selection set. So here we go, select by previous. Change the source item to Boolean 4, and the name of this, polygons from driver surface. We'll create a new group within the skull underscore hole group. And we are going to duplicate the constant instance. So duplicate, drag that into the new group. It will override everything. And then we're just going to change this group from polygon tag type material to selection set, and the polygon tag will be mouth. Now, the only thing we have left is the teeth. Now you might notice this is one of those little bumps I mentioned we might run into in the beginning. This is a funny kind of solution to this. This drove me a little bit crazy at first. It's a really quick fix. Let's just assign this color to the teeth, and then we'll address these kind of polygons that are getting the wrong color. Okay, so above this final Boolean, we'll just add a selection set. And it's already set the polygon. I'll just give it a name. We'll call it teeth. And the selection set, so we can give it a selection operation. We'll select by previous. Change the source item to Boolean 5 and the name to polygons from driver surface. And we're going to add a group. And I'll duplicate this constant instance and drag that into the new group. It overrides everything. Change this group texture layer from material polygon tag type to selection set, and we'll change the polygon tag to teeth. Okay, there we go. Now this is really, really strange, but the way you fix this, and this works about 99% of the time, is to save your work. So Control S, and come over to File, Revert. And I'll just click Yes because we want to revert the scene. And you can see now we don't have that strange behavior. I'm not entirely sure why that happens. I at first thought it had to do with the vertex order, but it doesn't. It's just a strange kind of thing that happens. Okay, so what I can do now is I can do a quick preview render. And you can see that even though we have different colors on this skull mask, the rounded edge shader is still kind of doing its job, which is nice. And that's mainly because we have this single material, which has the rounded edge width of 4 millimeters, and then everything within it is basically just a constant. So there's no other material for this main material to compete with. Okay, so what's nice about this is I can come over to the item list, and I can take the skull base, and I'll press R for scale, and I can scale the original, well, that's a little bit too much, but I can scale the original item. Let me just change it here 80% works. And everything kind of comes along for the ride. All of the Boolean mesh ops and everything comes along for the ride. You just come over here and change this back to 100%. And you can see that issue happened again. And it's a simple case of just saving your work and reverting the scene to get rid of this blue color. It does show up in the render. So we can just do that really quickly. But before I do, let me just come over to the eye mover and select that. And we'll just show how if I press Alt-X to go into a local action center, we can kind of change the eyes. And you can see when I moved the locator to adjust the eyes, that error went away. But it might come back. There, so it came back when I moved the eyes a little bit more. And I adjusted them and it went away. So it's just kind of funny behavior. You could always get rid of it, well, almost always with the save and the reverting of the scene. So I can just change the scale of these eyes to make them smaller. So I'm thinking it's a pretty interesting effect. Okay, so let's work on another kind of mesh op. I'll tie it back into this towards the end. Before I do, I just want to mention that some of the Boolean operations that I was doing might have seemed a little bit tedious. It's powerful, but it might have seemed a little bit too manual. I can't say enough good things about the Mop Booleans kit by William Vaughan. If you want to see videos on how this kit works, I would go to either Pixel Fondue or just type in Mop Booleans on YouTube. There's a lot of videos showing how this works. It was developed, co-developed by Tor Frick, and this is a piece by Tor, and it's really good for getting kind of semi-organic but mostly hard surface kind of assets, and it's really awesome. And then also Warren Marshall created kind of a little addition to it that allows you to do even more things. And Warren's kind of addition kind of gives you, if anyone's familiar with the compound trim feature in Mesh Fusion, it kind of gives you an easy kind of path to creating compound trim kind of effects. But you need the Mop Booleans kit for this edition by Warren to work. But again, I highly recommend that, especially if you're into kind of hard surface modeling. You can do everything that I showed here, but much faster, probably in about a minute. I mean, it's really incredible. Okay, so let me press N for a new mesh item, and I'll just call this CRV for curve underscore A. And I'm going to hide my skull outer and control spacebar to go into a front view from this viewport pie menu. Control 1 to bring back my grid work plane. And I'm going to enable the B-spline tool. I'm going to create a curve in this empty mesh item. I'll just make a quick letter, just a quick letter F. So I'm just dropping points, and I'm creating 3 points for every corner. That just gives me a nice tight corner. You don't have to do this. I'm being a little bit sloppy. You can be more careful. You can be less careful. It's really, the B-spline curve tool is a pretty flexible tool. So I'm just going to quickly finish off this letter F. And this kind of bottom part of the F is a little bit small, but that's okay. Like I said, this doesn't have to be perfect. Okay. And then to close this off, I'm just going to right-click on the initial point. And now I can just edit this, make this a little bit cleaner. And I'll just make this a little bit fatter, because that would have bothered me. It's just one of those things. Okay. That's looking good enough. And as I say that, I just keep working. Can't even help myself. There we go. Okay, that's good enough for this demonstration. So I'll press 3 to go into polygons mode. I'll select this, control spacebar to bring up my main pie menu or my viewport pie menu and choose perspective. Press R for scale and Alt-X to get out of local action center mode. And I just want to make sure that this is perfectly flat on the on the XY plane. So I have negative scale disabled. I want to make sure that there's no check in that box. And then I'm just going to scale this in Z. And that's looking good. And then I'm going to center this. So I'll come over to the vertex side tab and just choose center all. And then I could fill this curve, or I could create a new mesh item. Let me hide this curve by clicking the little icon, hit the eye icon, N for new mesh item, and I'll just call this fill underscore A. And I'm going to add a new operator. So I'll type in curve fill. If I click on this curve, it's going to expect me to provide a curve. So I'll just choose curve A. And we'll see if that works. Oops. This has been giving me some problems lately. Let me just move this texture group above here. So I might need to flip the actual curve because I'm not seeing anything here. So I'll come back to the curve and select it in polygons mode, F for flip. And now if I come back to my fill, you can see that we have some polygons there. So it was just a matter of coming back to the curve and pressing F for flip. Now in the fill properties, let me just press escape a few times. Back to this fill. In the curve fill properties, we have the method set to paving, which is good, and the fill steps set to 10. And that's why this is pretty dense. So I'm going to change that down to 5, which is as low as you can go at the moment. And I'm liking that. Maybe I'll do 6. There we go. And I'll come back over to my curve, select the actual curve, and then it's really funny. As I was doing this, I didn't realize it was so kind of off center, or I didn't realize it was rotated like that. I think I'm working with my head tilted, which might explain that. Okay, so now I'm going to bring back the skull outer. There we go. And that F is pretty small. I'm actually going to take the fill underscore A, and I'm wondering if I should try to move this with a locator. I think I will. So above this curve fill, I'm going to add an operator, and I'll type in LOC for locator, and that gives us this transform effector. I'm going to press W for move, and I'll move this about here. And E for rotate, I'll just rotate this like so. And I'd like this to actually be bigger. I can do this in one of two ways. I can press R for scale, Alt X to go into local action center mode. I can scale this up on the XY plane, or I can go to the original curve, and I can just scale the actual original curve in the, oh, there's a little crash for you. I always recommend sending in a crash report. I'm not going to send it now because I want to relaunch Modo as quickly as possible. But we do see those crash reports, and every time you fill those in, it definitely helps us. So I'm not seeing, oh, you know what? I was looking at the wrong chat group. I don't believe it. I didn't mean to ignore you guys. I was actually looking at the Google chat group, which is empty. So you guys might have been asking some good questions. Let me just reload the autosave. Okay, so we have our F. Let me actually try to see if you guys have any questions here. Oof, there's a bunch. Okay. Sorry I neglected that, guys. I was actually looking at the empty group chat, and I didn't realize I was looking at the wrong chat. Okay, let me just power through this, and then maybe I'll get some questions towards the end. So we have our fill, and if I come over to the curve fill, it's already set to 6, which is good. I'll make my skull outer mesh item visible again. On top of this curve fill, I'll add a locator. I'm not even going to bother naming this locator. I'll just press W for move. We'll move it into the front here. I'll hide that curve there. I'll just use the locator to kind of scale this, kind of the initial method that I was showing. W for move, Alt X to go into local action center mode. Move this like so. And I basically want to constrain this to the forehead of the character. So I'll hide my transform effector, and then above this transform effector, I'll add a constrain surface constraint. So I'll double click that. It will ask us for the constraint surface. We'll choose Let's do skull outer. We want a directional. It's worth testing these other options, but we definitely want directional, and I think we want Z axis. And you can see that it's not doing quite what we want it to do. I can see it. I can see the polygons here, and it's stretching a little bit. So I can choose. I can select this transform effector, W for move, in items mode, and I'll turn on ghosting, and I'll move this in the Y a little bit, and I can see that it's stretching a little bit, but that's fine. But now if I turn ghosting off and come back to the surface constraint, we still have to figure out why it's only on the underside. So what I think is causing this is an option in the surface constraint properties. If we just invert this, I think that will, yep, that solves it. And here you can see that it's now constrained perfectly. If I were to offset it a little bit, maybe 2 millimeters, but we can start to see that option there. And what's nice about this is, let me save this, because the last time I went and adjusted the curve, we got a crash. But let me actually roll the dice again. This time I'll hide the curve fill, and I'll hide the skull. Control S to save, Control spacebar to go to a front view, 3 for polygons mode. I'll select this B-spline curve, come back over to the B-spline curve tool, change the mode from edit to add, and actually add, we'll change this to an E. And hopefully this will kind of show off the procedural nature of working this way. Why the skull has a letter on his head is anybody's guess. I guess we've all seen crazier things in you know, popular culture. There we go. Okay, so I'll hide that curve, make that fill visible, turn on the skull outer, go back to perspective mode, and the only thing that's odd now is trying to figure out why that E is so low now, because it's definitely working. It's definitely constraining. Whoop, there's a little crash. Okay, so as I mentioned, it's always worth sending that in. I'm not going to do it now just because, you know, I don't want to make you guys watch me write up a quick report. So we'll just restart Modo really quickly. And I'll just go back to where we were, like so. Turn on skull outer and come back over to fill A. There we go. Okay, and I could change the color of this and remove that offset. We can put that back down to 0. I can thicken these polygons, so we can come over to surface constraint. Above this, we can add, let's just do a bevel, polygon bevel. And I'll just move that up like so, to about there. All right, we're getting some weirdness there. That's fine, it's not too bad. And then if I hide the skull outer, you can see we don't have a bottom for this. I can enable thicken polygons. Now we have a nice bottom and top to that F. And then segments, we can just bump that up to 12. And at any point, you can always just freeze this. So if I wanted this to no longer be procedural, I can just right click on this fill A item and choose either freeze or duplicate and freeze. And that will make it no longer procedural. So now you no longer see that little gear icon. All of these other items that we used to create the this little mask item here, they're all procedural. So everything can be changed. But I just froze this F, and maybe I can select the polygons, W for move, Alt X to go into local space, something like this. And now there's no reason why I can't hide this item and come back over to the skull outer and add another Boolean. We'll just add it above this second selection set. So add operator, Boolean, We'll choose fill A, and we'll just subtract it. And there we go. So with that, we still have a few minutes left. I'll just check out the chat. Hello, everybody. I got a bunch of people just saying hello. Hey, Sonny. Somebody said test_01 is the worst file name ever. I use it so often, it's grown on me. No, just kidding. It is a pretty bad name. Okay, it doesn't look like there's any questions. I hope that was a little bit insightful. Again, I can't say enough nice things about the mop boolean toolkit. It's definitely the way to go if you're going to be doing a lot of hard surface boolean modeling. But yeah, I mean, this was just basically to show you how you can do it manually. Hopefully in future Modonaut Mondays, we can do some more complex procedural modeling. So that about wraps it up for today. As I mentioned, we really only scratched the surface of procedural modeling. The procedural system allows us to do far more than just iterative modeling. So on behalf of Foundry, I'd like to thank you for joining me. I'll bring up this quick image to show you where you can reach us and where we are on social media. On Facebook, we are at thefoundry.modo. On Twitter, we are at foundrymodo. On Instagram, we are foundrymodo. And for more Modo videos and quick clips, check out our Modo Geeks TV YouTube channel. And finally, if anybody has any questions, feel free to email us at modo.help@foundry.com. Okay, thanks, everybody. I just want to say that I hope everyone enjoys the rest of your September, and I'll see you next time.